Welcome back to Patch Me If You Can podcast.
Yeah.
Today, um, we're diving deep into a topic that's oh, fascinating but also kind of unsettling. North Korean cyber attacks, specifically those targeting the crypto world. You sent over
Right.
two really interesting sources, and I can't wait to unpack all this with you.
It's definitely a landscape that's constantly shifting, that's for sure.
Right, so we've got, okay, this FBI alert. It's called Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3. North Korea aggressively targeting crypto industry with well-disguised social engineering attacks, straight from September 3rd, 2024. And then to add some context, we have this news piece from Bleeping Computer. It's called U.S. Gov says North Korea stole over $659 million in crypto last year. Published just recently,
Yeah.
January 14th, 2025, by Sergio Gatlan. So what jumps out at you right away?
Well, I think the sheer scale of what we're dealing with here is pretty staggering.
All right.
The U.S. government's putting the figure at over $659 million stolen. But some analysts, like Chainalysis, believe the real number could be double that, closer to $1.34 billion. That's not petty cash. And it suggests a level of organization that's, well, frankly, alarming.
It does. It makes you wonder how they're pulling this off. I mean,
Yeah.
we've all heard about phishing scams and hacking and things like that. But the FBI alert really digs into something called social engineering. And that sounds way more insidious.
Oh, it is. Think of it this way. Basic hacking is like forcing your way through a locked door. Social engineering is more like convincing someone to give you the key. And these North Korean attackers are masters at it. They're not just sending out generic spam emails. This is targeted, personalized.
And the alert goes into how these attacks often start with meticulous research. Like they're using social media to build profiles on potential victims, figuring out where they work, who they know, even their hobbies and interests. It's almost like they're building a whole fake identity just to target one person.
Exactly. And then they use that information to craft these extremely convincing scenarios. Like, let's say you're a software developer and you have a public GitHub profile. They might create a fake recruiter persona offering you this amazing job, like a dream job.
Yeah.
At a cutting-edge company. Or maybe they dangle a lucrative investment opportunity. Knowing you're interested in cryptocurrency, the key is making it believable.
So it's all about playing on people's desires and vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And the scary part is, they're really good at it. The FBI report mentions that a lot of these attackers, they're fluent in English, and they're deeply knowledgeable about the tech world, especially cryptocurrency, so they can hold their own in technical conversations, which makes them even more convincing.
So how do you even protect yourself against something like that? It feels like anyone could fall for it.
You're right. Vigilance is key. One thing that the FBI emphasizes is the importance of verifying everything. Like if you get an unsolicited job offer or investment proposal, don't just take their word for it. You have to do your own research. Look up the company, check LinkedIn profiles, make sure it all adds up. And this might seem basic, but never click on links or download attachments from unknown sources. Even if they look legit, they could be laced with malware.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what about the actual tactics they use once they've made contact? Are there any red flags? You know, that scream. This is a North Korean cyber attack.
Well, there are some telltale signs. One that the FBI specifically mentions is the insistence on using unusual software or communication platforms. For example, let's say you're applying for a job and they ask you to download a specific messaging app you've never heard of, or they want to interview you on a platform that's not Zoom or Teams or something widely used. That should be a red flag. Legitimate companies usually stick with established tools.
So it's about being wary of anything that feels off
Right?
or deviates from standard procedures.
Exactly. And if someone is pushing you to do something that makes you uncomfortable, like sharing sensitive information or making a quick financial decision, trust your gut. It's better to be safe than sorry.
That's really good advice. But this whole thing with North Korea training IT warriors specifically to pull off these scams, that just blows my mind. What makes them so effective? Is it just the training?
Well, that's a big part of it. According to the Bleeping Computer article, North Korea has been investing heavily in cyber capabilities for years. They're essentially cultivating a generation of highly skilled hackers, some of whom are sent abroad specifically to infiltrate companies and steal cryptocurrency. But there's another element at play here that's even more chilling. State sponsorship.
You mean these hackers aren't just lone wolves operating in the shadows?
Not necessarily. There's strong evidence to suggest that many of these operations are directly supported, or at least sanctioned, by the North Korean government.
Wow. That's a whole other level of complexity and danger.
Yeah.
So if they're this sophisticated and organized, what can even be done to stop them?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. But before we jump into that, let's take a closer look at exactly how these IT warriors are infiltrating companies and gaining access to sensitive systems.
Okay, let's get into that. You mentioned earlier that they're not just hiding out in North Korea, but they're actually seeking employment abroad. The Bleeping Computer article had this crazy example about a North Korean IT worker
Mm-hmm.
who actually got hired as a principal software engineer at Nobi4, a cybersecurity company of all places.
Yeah, and that case really underscores how deep their deception goes. These individuals often use stolen identities, they forge documents, and they even create these elaborate backstories to make themselves seem like legitimate job candidates. They can ace technical interviews, pass background checks, the whole 9 yards.
It's terrifying to think that someone could be working right alongside you, seemingly competent, trustworthy, while secretly plotting to steal valuable data.
It is, and that's why it's so crucial for companies to be proactive. They need to be aware of these tactics, implement robust security measures, and be extremely diligent in their hiring processes.
I'm guessing that's a whole other can of worms we could open. But for now, I think it's time to shift gears a little and talk about what happens once they're in. You mentioned social engineering earlier, and I'm really curious to understand exactly how they manipulate people into handing over their crypto. This is where it gets really fascinating.
It is,
God.
and it's where things get a lot more psychological because at its core, social engineering is all about exploiting human nature, our trust, our desire to be helpful, even our fear of missing out.
So it's less about brute force hacking and more about playing mind games.
Exactly, and they use a whole arsenal of tactics to get what they want.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those.
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize that this isn't just a tech problem, it's a human problem.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes it so challenging to defend against.
Okay, I'm ready for the deep dive into the psychology of these attacks.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific techniques they use to manipulate their victims?
Well, let's start with one of the most common and effective tactics, pretexting.
Pretexting.
It's basically creating a false scenario or identity to gain someone's trust and get them to reveal information or perform an action they wouldn't otherwise do. Remember that fake recruiter we talked about earlier? That's a classic example of pretexting.
Ah, okay, so they're essentially playing a role, like an actor in a movie.
Yeah, and they can be very convincing. They might impersonate a tech support agent, a government official, or even a friend or colleague. The key is to create a believable pretext that lowers the victim's guard.
Yeah, I can see how that would be effective. I mean, we're all conditioned to trust certain figures of authority
Hmm.
or people we think we know.
Exactly. And once they've established that initial trust, they can start to manipulate the victim into doing their bidding.
So what comes next? What kind of things do they try to get people to do?
Well, it really depends on the specific goal of the attack. Sometimes it's about stealing login credentials or financial information. They might trick the victim into clicking on a fake link that takes them to a phishing website that's designed to capture their username and password. Or they might persuade them to download malware disguised as a legitimate software update.
Well, that sounds scary. I mean, I consider myself pretty tech savvy, but I could definitely see myself falling for something like that if I wasn't paying close attention.
It happens to the best of us. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to always err on the side of caution. Pretexting isn't the only weapon in their arsenal. They also use a technique called baiting.
Baiting, so like dangling a carrot in front of someone.
Exactly. It's about offering something enticing, a free download, a discount code, access to exclusive content, to lure the victim into a trap.
Okay, I've definitely seen those scams before, like click here to win a free iPad.
Exactly. But in the context of these sophisticated North Korean attacks, the bait can be much more subtle and tailored to the victim's interest. Let's say you're a cryptocurrency enthusiast. They might offer you early access to a new trading platform or a chance to invest in a promising ICO.
I can see how that would be tempting, especially if you're eager to get in on the ground floor of something that could be the next big thing. So how do you tell the difference between a legitimate offer and a trap?
That's where critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism come in. Always ask yourself, is this too good to be true? If something seems incredibly generous or promises unrealistic returns, it's probably a scam. And remember, if you didn't actively seek out the offer, it's always a good idea to be wary.
So always be suspicious of unsolicited offers, even if they seem to come from a trusted source.
Exactly, because these attackers are experts at creating fake websites, email addresses, and social media profiles that look almost identical to the real thing.
Wow, that's really unsettling. I'm starting to realize that you can never be too careful in the digital world.
You're right. But it's not just about being cautious. It's also about understanding the psychological principles that these attackers exploit. Because once you know how they operate, you're much better equipped to spot their tricks and avoid falling victim to their schemes.
So what other psychological tactics do they use?
Well, another powerful one is authority. We're all conditioned to obey authority figures, whether it's a police officer, a doctor, or even someone with a fancy title.
Right. I can see how that would play into these attacks.
Think about it. If someone claiming to be a high-ranking government official contacts you and they request sensitive information, you're much more likely to comply, even if you have a nagging feeling that something isn't quite right.
Especially if they create a sense of urgency or pressure, like you need to act now or there will be serious consequences.
Exactly. They might say something like, your account has been compromised and you need to verify your information immediately. Or, there's a security breach and we need your cooperation to prevent further damage.
So it's all about creating a sense of panic and urgency to bypass people's rational thinking.
Precisely. And they're incredibly skilled at playing on people's emotions, especially fear and anxiety.
Okay. That's pretty chilling. I'm starting to think I need to update my entire security protocol after this deep dive.
You and everyone else. But the good news is, awareness is half the battle. Once you understand the tactics they use and the psychology behind them, you're in a much better position to protect yourself.
So, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners, especially those who are involved in the cryptocurrency world?
Well, let's start with the basics. Always verify everything. Don't take anything at face value, especially when it comes to unsolicited offers or requests for sensitive information. Do your own research. Double-check email addresses and websites, and never hesitate to ask for clarification or proof of identity.
Right, and trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is.
Absolutely. And if you're ever unsure, it's always a good idea to reach out to a trusted friend, a colleague, or cybersecurity expert for advice.
And I'm guessing it's crucial to keep up with the latest security best practices and to stay informed about emerging threats.
You're absolutely right. The cyber landscape is constantly evolving, and these attackers are always coming up with new ways to trick people.
So it's really about being proactive
Yeah,
and taking a multi-layered approach to security.
exactly. And that includes not only technical measures, like strong passwords and two-factor authentication, but also psychological awareness and critical thinking.
Okay. That's a lot to digest. But I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have. And I think it's a good foundation for understanding the threat we're facing.
Right. And it sets us up perfectly to move on to the next phase of our discussion. What to do if you think you've been targeted.
Let's dive into that.
Before we do, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that this whole situation with North Korea, using cyber attacks to fund their regime, it's incredibly complex, and there's no easy solution. But by understanding the tactics they use and the psychology behind their operations, we can at least start to empower ourselves and others to take action and protect ourselves.
I completely agree.
Okay, so let's talk about what to do if you find yourself staring down the barrel of a potential North Korean cyber attack.
It's a bit like realizing you might have a venomous snake in your house. Your first instinct is to freeze.
But
Then you need to act fast and decisively.
okay, so let's say you've noticed some red flags, or maybe you've even fallen victim to one of these attacks. What's the first thing you should do?
The FBI is really clear about this. Immediately disconnect the affected device from the internet. Unplug the Ethernet cable, turn off the Wi-Fi, whatever it takes to cut off that connection. This helps contain the damage and prevents them from digging deeper into your systems or stealing more data.
That makes sense, but you shouldn't just shut down the computer entirely.
Right, you're right. Turning it off could actually erase valuable evidence that could help track down the attackers. The FBI actually recommends leaving the device powered on, but isolated from the network.
Interesting. So you've quarantined the infected device. What's the next step?
Purport it, get on the phone or go online and file a detailed report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. They call it IC3. You can find them at www.ic3.gov. This is so important not just for your own case, but because it helps authorities track these attacks, understand the bigger picture, and hopefully prevent others from becoming victims.
When you say detailed report, what kind of information are we talking about?
Everything you can remember, screenshots of any communications you had with the attackers, emails, messages, anything like that, any suspicious links or attachments they sent you, usernames, online accounts involved, any financial details. Basically, you're gathering evidence for a cybercrime case.
It sounds a bit overwhelming, honestly, if you're not sure what's relevant or what to include.
The IC3 website actually has really helpful guidelines on what to include in your report.
Right.
And don't worry about being a technical expert. Just provide as much detail as you can, and the investigators will know what to do with it.
Okay, that's reassuring. So you've reported it to the FBI. What else can you do?
Yeah.
This is where I'd be feeling pretty helpless, I think.
It's a natural reaction, and depending on the scale of the attack, you might want to consider professional help. There are incident response companies who specialize in cybersecurity and digital forensics. They can assess the damage, help you recover lost data, and strengthen your defenses to prevent future attacks.
It sounds like calling in the cavalry.
In a way, it is, but there's something else you can do that's equally important, and it doesn't cost a dime. Talk about it. Share your experience with colleagues, friends, family, anyone who might benefit from hearing your story.
That's interesting. It's not something you'd usually think of as part of security protocol.
But it is, raising awareness is so crucial. The more people know about these tactics, the harder it becomes for these attackers to operate.
So we're all part of the solution in a way.
Exactly. By being vigilant, sharing information, and taking proactive steps to protect ourselves, we can collectively push back against this threat.
Going back to the articles we started with, it really struck me how these attacks aren't just random acts of cybercrime. They're part of a much bigger, more organized effort. This bleeping computer piece mentioned that the U.S. State Department is offering a $5 million reward for information that disrupts North Korean front companies involved in these IT worker schemes. That's not something you see every day.
It's a pretty clear signal of how seriously they're taking this threat, and remember, this is just one piece of the puzzle. North Korea has been linked to numerous other high-profile cyber attacks, targeting financial institutions, governments, and even critical infrastructure all over the world.
It's kind of a sobering reminder that the cyber landscape is a lot more dangerous than most people realize, and that the threats are constantly evolving.
Which is why staying informed and proactive is more crucial now than ever before.
Okay, so we've talked about how to recognize these attacks, how to protect yourself, and what to do if you become a victim. But I think there's still one big question looming over this entire conversation. Why is North Korea so heavily involved in cybercrime, especially targeting the cryptocurrency world?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it? And to understand the answer, we need to look at the bigger picture of North Korea's geopolitical situation and its economic realities.
Let's see that.
North Korea is a heavily sanctioned country facing international isolation and severe economic hardship. They're desperate for hard currency to fund their regime, develop their military, and maintain their grip on power.
And cryptocurrency is a perfect target for them, right? It's decentralized, relatively anonymous, and incredibly difficult to trace.
Exactly. By stealing cryptocurrency, they can bypass traditional financial systems, evade sanctions, and generate revenue without leaving a clear paper trail.
It's like a modern-day digital heist playing out on a global scale.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a heist that's becoming increasingly sophisticated and lucrative.
So it's not just about stealing a few bitcoins here and there.
Not anymore. We're talking about highly organized operations backed by state resources and expertise, targeting millions, even billions of dollars.
It's a scary thought, and it makes you wonder, what can the international community do to combat this?
Well, it's a complex issue with no easy answers. There are efforts to impose stricter sanctions, track down and prosecute those involved, and strengthen international cooperation to disrupt these networks.
But it feels like a bit of a cat and mouse game, doesn't it?
It does, because as soon as one avenue is shut down, they find another way to adapt and exploit vulnerabilities.
So it's a constant battle to stay one step ahead.
Exactly. And it's a battle that requires a multifaceted approach involving governments, law enforcement agencies, cybersecurity experts, and even everyday individuals like ourselves.
Because ultimately, it's our data, our finances, and our security that's at stake.
Precisely.
Okay, I think we've really unpacked the why behind these attacks. It's not just about random cybercrime. It's about a nation-state using sophisticated tactics to achieve its strategic goals.
That's a very astute observation.
Well, I've learned a lot from this conversation. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit more vigilant, but also a little overwhelmed by the scale of this threat.
It's understandable, but remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding how these attacks work, we can take steps to protect ourselves and make it more difficult for these criminals to succeed.
So it's not about living in fear. It's about being informed and empowered.
Exactly. And remember, we're not in this alone. There are resources available, experts we can consult, and a growing community of people who are committed to fighting back against these threats.
That's a really good point. It's easy to feel powerless when you're thinking about something this big, but we do have agency. We can make choices that make ourselves less vulnerable.
Absolutely. And the more people who kind of adopt a proactive security mindset, the harder it becomes for these attackers to operate. It's like herd immunity, but for cyber threats.
I love that analogy. Okay, so
Yeah.
as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Hmm. I think it boils down to this: cybersecurity is no longer just about firewalls and antivirus software. It's about understanding human psychology, recognizing manipulation tactics, and being constantly on guard against those who would exploit our trust.
So it's a combination of tech savvy and street smarts.
Exactly. And remember, these North Korean attackers are patient, persistent, and highly skilled at playing the long game. They might spend months or even years building rapport and trust before making their move.
Which is why it's so crucial to be vigilant and skeptical, even when dealing with people you think you know or trust.
That's right. Always verify, never assume. And if something feels off, trust your gut. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Solid advice, and remember, if you do encounter any suspicious activity, report it to the authorities immediately. You could be preventing yourself or someone else from becoming the next victim.
Absolutely. Reporting these incidents helps law enforcement track these attackers, develop countermeasures, and ultimately make the cyber world a safer place for everyone.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into North Korean cyber attacks. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely feeling a bit more vigilant now, and I have a whole new appreciation for the complexity of this issue.
As you should. Knowledge is power, and by staying informed and proactive, we can all play a part in mitigating these threats.
Thank you for listening to Patch Me If You Can podcast. See you next time.